Hello, everyone. So uh, I have to replace the moderator temporarily. I'm happy to moderate this session. I mean, the topics are very timely, interesting. Some of them also touch my personal study, the focus of my region. So every presenter has 10 minutes to present his topic. We'll start, without... so I will just name, we'll start with Luis on NATO's southern flank and whether we need a new strategy. Thank you.
Can I?
Yeah.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. It's my pleasure. I work in the Universidade Autonoma de Lisboa, so I teach here. And what I'm going to talk about in the next 10 minutes, it's a little bit about NATO. Okay, and I will try to explain why we should look for a new dimension in the south border or the south part of NATO. I have a couple of speaking notes, and I'm going to follow some of them. But what is more important for me and the end of the conclusion of my study is that NATO has to have a new approach for the south, okay? Because normally the border south of NATO is the Mediterranean Sea, and it goes a little bit further to the south. But in my view, that's not correct. And in my view, what I'm going to explain is that we need another vision, we need another strategy, because NATO should look further to the south, be more engaged in the Atlantic South, which is completely out of area of concerning for the NATO. And in my view, it makes sense to have a new vision, a new strategy related with this approach. The North Atlantic are facing now one of the biggest challenges in the history of the 75 years. Last summit last week what was very challenging for all the countries. And of course, we have faced now a lot of problems and mostly a lot of questions about what is the next step. Why should NATO be engaged in a global way? We know that the Atlantic Alliance is the oldest military alliance in the world and is become the center of gravity for our countries. At least for Portugal, NATO is very important. I will put NATO as the most important organization concerning our security and defense. And that's why I think the majority of the countries that are also playing with NATO, they feel the same. And that's also why we need to look NATO for a new dimension, a new approach. So in this last 75 years, lots of discussion about NATO, regional NATO, global NATO, borders about NATO, flank. I don't like the terminology of flank. Flank means something very static, okay? And nothing is static anymore. Nothing is static anymore. And of course, we are facing now Ukraine, Russia, Gaza Strip, Israel, Iran. We are facing a lot of regional conflicts, and NATO are now more than ever, I would say, facing challenging in the new dimension and mostly what is the role of NATO in this new order. So the alliance is very important for us. The alliance is very important for the regional global security. And of course, we need to be more focused on NATO because NATO still as the most important organization in related with the security and defense in Europe, and I would say in the world. And of course, we have to look for the new dimensions of the conflict, not anymore land, sea, and air. We have to talk about cybersecurity. We have to talk about space. We have to look for the new dimensions of the conflict. And in the last summit, you all remember that we are increasing our investments on defense. We are now talking about 5% of our GDP, which is more than the double for the most of the countries until 2030. And of course, this brings new responsibilities, and this brings also the opportunity to have a new vision, another strategy for another regional areas. And when we talk about NATO, we talk about regional and southern border of NATO, looking for what we call the close neighborhood. It means until it focused mostly about the Mediterranean area and the Sahel. But it makes no sense, because now we are facing a lot of threats, a lot of challenges, and the security is not able to look for this kind of borders specifically in this area. And we need to know what we can do to improve the security in these areas. Because, as we all know, the insecurity in the Sahel is the problem for Europe, is a problem for the alliance also. So we need to be aware, we need at least to understand what's happening in these regions. And that's why, in my view, the NATO should have a strategy. And if you have a strategy, you have a concern. If you have a strategy, you have to look what's happening in these areas and look for answers to your challenge and to your questions. I don't know if you are aware, but NATO 2 years ago, they built what we can call a think tank, a small think tank to study what is our major threats in the South. And some of these threats and some of these ideas came with, of course, terrorism, traffic of weapons, and the most of these problems we already know. But these problems, they don't see under a deep dimension. They see only in the logical, very teeny area that goes only to the Mediterranean Sea and the Sahel the most. And in my view, I think we should look for the Atlantic South. And let me be frank. When China going to be a naval base in the Atlantic South, and this is going to happen very soon, all the game will change. And NATO is not aware about what's happening in the Atlantic South. And this my comment, in my view, is that we need to have a more global view for the South, what I call the Deep South, okay? So we need to be engaged in the Deep South, because the Deep South is where the new dimensions of the geopolitical will be, I would say, more challenging. I'm talking about China. Of course, I can talk also about Russia. As you all know, Russia is one of the biggest players in Africa, and we don't know about what's happening in Africa. NATO doesn't know what's happening in Africa with this concern. So this report, I have the report here. It's 33 pages, and these 33 pages, they show some aspects that we already know. But my comments is that the report is not, I will not say well done, because of course it's well done, but not entirely to the south part of the Atlantic. And they should be to the South Atlantic to be more aware about what's happening in this area. Of course, this report was presented in Washington. And of course, in all these summits, the South flank was always some references. Not the last summit, because the last summit in Hague, the final declaration, there's only 2 pages, and nothing specifically about what is the role of NATO in the south part of the Atlantic. And this is my concern, and this is what I can underline. And I'm going to finish, and I will need to develop a little bit more about what is the Deep South, okay? But in my view, the Deep South is the entire South, until, of course, Africa, Horn of Africa, South Mediterranean, Atlantic, South Atlantic, all these areas, they should be part of the South Atlantic and part of the flank. I don't like the term flank, okay? It's a little bit old-fashioned concept. We need to be aware about what's happening in Syria, what's happening in Mali, what's happening in the Gulf of Guinea, what's happening in Brazil, for example. Okay, this is outside of our scope. This is outside of our radar, and we need to be more aware about this. So my last recommendations is that NATO should be more aware. They should have a special envoy for Africa. Okay, we don't have nothing about NATO in Africa. Not a single department, not a single person that represents NATO in Africa. And this is something that I would like to mention. We need to do assessments. We need to make a sort of summits with the African countries. We need to understand better what's happening in the Gulf of Guinea. We need to expand our regional influence in these areas. We need to review the NATO Strategic Direction South mandate, okay? And we need to be more focused about the Istanbul Cooperation Initiative, the Mediterranean Dialogue, and a couple of organizations. And thank you for your attention. And my last comment is that I've been talking about this, and I hope that NATO can, of course, the priority should be Ukraine, it should be Russia and the Pacific, but not forget the South, because the South Atlantic is going to be part of the decisions, of the geopolitical decision in the next years. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Luis. As someone who comes from the southeast of that, I have a lot of questions, but I will later add it. So we'll move to our next speaker, Taha Kalaycı, to talk about the new challenges for the transatlantic security, especially AI-based threats for critical infrastructure.
Thank you very much. My name is Taha Kalaycı. I work as a research assistant in Cukurova University, Adana, and I am about to finish my PhD thesis in Middle East Technical University, Ankara. So I will also talk about NATO. One of the strategies that Professor Bernardino mentioned, it is critical infrastructure and AI. So AI, a popular subject these days, and indeed AI has introduced new dimensions of hybrid warfare that directly affects the critical infrastructure of NATO countries. Now, malicious programs and unregulated AI can be weaponized in a ways that blur the lines between physical and digital domains. So it is actually, I'm also new to this research area. I study Russian international propaganda, but during my research, I noticed that the Russians also used deepfake videos to disrupt the social resiliency in Ukraine by using Volodymyr Zelensky's AI-generated videos. So that's why I started my research on this area. So let's start quickly by defining what critical infrastructure is. We can define, there's no universal definition, but we can define them simply systems and physical and digital systems and networks whose incapacitation would significantly disrupt a nation's functioning. So according to NATO, there is a NATO definition, the infrastructure assets, facilities, systems, and information networks that support the military, economic, political, and social life of a nation, a NATO nation or partner nation, are considered critical infrastructures. To give examples, name it, telecommunication networks, power grids, nuclear power plants, e-government systems, health databases, you name it. So quickly, I will explain the categorization of NATO on critical infrastructure. There are three types. First one is critical national infrastructure. So I made a huge mistake. I forgot to start my PowerPoint presentation. I am seeing this, but you are not seeing this, so I am so sorry. I have to.
You can share.
Yeah, could you open the PowerPoint slide? Can I use that gadget? OBSERVARE. Yeah. Also about that. So I already talked about the first slide, so I was in the second slide. So critical national infrastructure. These are assets, facilities required by a nation's normal functioning, such as e-government system or health networks. And second, mission vital infrastructure. These are critical for NATO's operational needs, like the military oil pipelines. And thirdly, key infrastructure. It is a combination of first two. So the incapacitation of key infrastructure would significantly affect the functioning of both missions and operations, and also the functioning of a country. So while our critical infrastructures are critical, the political target, because they are, I already mentioned the importance of the critical infrastructure, but they are also the symbols of a state authority. Let me clarify this. Targeting the critical infrastructure can undermine the public cohesion and disrupt the moral foundations of a nation. So there are three types threats against critical infrastructure. First one, physical threats. I don't go details on this. Second one, cyber threats. As in the 2021 in United States, one of the biggest oil pipeline network was conducted by Colonial Pipeline, and there was a ransomware attack, a cyber attack. They, I think, around $5 million demanded, and at the end of the day, Colonial Pipeline had to give $5 million to the hackers, because they completely paralyzed the oil system in the east of United States. So third one is natural threats like earthquakes, hurricanes, and fire. So you can see in the slide that the Fukushima after the earthquake, you all know about this. So what is the NATO's strategy on this? So in 2022, NATO adopted a 360-degree approach. It was the project of the former Secretary Stoltenberg, and in 2021 in Brussels, they started an initiative, Diana Defense Innovation Accelerator for the North Atlantic. It aims to increase the cooperation between private sector and the universities among the universities in the member states. So also in the they released an AI strategy in 2021, but it mostly about adopting AI, not it's not about taking measures against the AI threats. So AI-based threats, they start the nexus because they somehow connects the physical threats and cyber threats, because you can weaponize them, you can use them on drones, you can use large language models to reach how-to manuals. I will come to large language models in detail, but they are text generators that mimic human language, like ChatGPT or Google's Gemini or Twitter Grok or DeepSeek of China. So they can also break into computer systems and cause real-world damages, like shutting down water supplies. So they mix the cyber and real-world threats, makes it harder to protect systems and need sophisticated security strategies. So I think I have to speed a little bit. So there are threats against AI systems, and there are threats stemming from AI systems. So this is my categorization. First one is threats against AI system. The critical infrastructure in the NATO member states are mostly use legacy systems that are very old, but low-cost systems. So they tend to switch to AI systems, but there is a risk of it because now there is a possibility of being too prone to cyber attacks. So threats by using AI, this is the important part of this presentations. There are 4 types of AI threats against real-world targets. First one is autonomous drones. So second one is AI-based cyber attacks. I mentioned it. Each day there are almost 2,000 cyber attacks in the world, and 40% of them are AI based actually. And the propaganda, this is why I started this research. They can create deepfake videos and generate political narratives by using AI. And lastly, large language models, which mimic human language to generate and translate text. So the most popular ones are OpenAI, ChatGPT, Google Gemini, China's DeepSeek, X, and started Grok. And there are many initiatives and startups. So they are being called large language models. They simulate the human language text, but they need prompts, they need comments to answer you. They don't act in the science fiction movies. So they do not process any data without taking command from humans. So the biggest threat in this, they are right now regulated, but the technology of AI is rapidly changing. And now if you ask ChatGPT, for example, how to make an assassination weapon, it will not answer you. But in 10 years, I am sure that in the future, there will be unregulated large language models, and they will answer this question. So it will create a chance to nation states, enemy nation states, non-state actors, and even local actors to reach that how to use manuals, and there will be a chance to exploit them. So, and there is a measure that we can actually prevent it from happening. And another point here is that NATO has no capacity to enforce any regulations. The only thing NATO can do to increase the cooperation between nation states and private sector and universities, like in the Diana program. But for example, if you follow the US politics, Ted Cruz gave an offer declared 10-year AI moratorium in the Senate under the scope of Big Beautiful Bill. So he offered to postpone regulation in AI for 10 years. He tried to prevent the US states to get involved in the regulation of AI. He simply tried to get rid of regulation, but it was declined in the Senate. It just happened in this week. So I am finishing here, and I can say that my biggest fear, again, the unregulated large language models like private GPTs or machine learning systems that will allow radicals and the enemy units, they will allow them to engage in terrorist activities, for example. So that's all. Thank you for listening to me. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Taha, for reflecting. Hopefully, AI will not replace us one day. Instead of having humans on the panel, we'll have robots or something. We'll move to the third speaker, Sylvia Tiryaki, to talk about the EU enlargement and geopolitical imperatives at Turkey and Ukraine.
Thank you. I think someone complained about the gender imbalance in the panels on Tuesday. I think we fixed it up today, right? Let me share my PowerPoint presentation if I can make it. How should I do that?
Yeah.
What should I do?
And now you
Okay.
just go to Zoom and you will click on the button.
Share. And this one. Do you see it now or no?
To click on
Share. How is it?
click here and here.
Here and
ball.
here. How is it now? Good. We are getting there, right? Or not? Okay. Okay, so my name is Sylvia Tiryaki, and I'm an associate professor at Bratislava International School of Liberal Arts. And today what I'm going to talk about, I'm going to share with you result of my research. The research is actually not new. It's oh my God, it's almost 20 years, more than 20 years old research. What I did actually now recently, I have decided to look at my long-term research, compare the findings of this book. This book was published in 2006. It was published by a Polish institute. I'm not promoting it now, but it's necessary to talk about it. And the title of the book is EU Accession Prospects for Turkey and Ukraine. So again, I have to emphasize that it was published in 2006. We started working on it with my colleagues in 2004. Now with the invasion of Russia, of Ukraine by Russia in 2002, I was thinking like, okay, maybe it's a good time, and with the speeded process of Ukraine enlargement, accession process of Ukraine to European Union, I was thinking like maybe it's a good time to revision my findings, revision the findings of my colleagues, and look at the 20 years old accession process of both countries, where we got and how we got where we are. So basically, the main argument of the paper that I wrote, but it hasn't been published yet, and I will be very happy to hear your contributions. I will be very happy to include them into the final version of the paper, is that the EU enlargement strategy is undergoing a profound transformation using the geopolitical realist lens. I compare Turkey and Ukraine, how they reflect this shift. And my question is, and it's a question to you as well, that if Ukraine is now fast-tracked due to the security concerns, we must ask why not Turkey? Many things have changed. As you can see, when I'm talking about this book, I'm talking also about Turkey and Ukraine. But when I'm in 2025, I talk about these two countries, I already talk about Turkey and Ukraine. But that's only a etymological thing. But I mean, many other things have changed as well. So my aim is not to compare these two countries in the way that I would say that Ukraine is more fit or Turkey is more fit. It's, in my view, both of them are needed and necessary for European Union under certain conditions, under certain circumstances. That's okay. But what I'm actually trying to demonstrate here is that the shift from a value-based enlargement policy, at least declared on paper, has been supplemented, not replaced, but supplemented by the security shift. The article, the paper is also not focusing on the enlargement per se, but its emphasis on strategic autonomy, which is necessary. To talk about security and capacity building aligns directly with the idea of that the enlargement can serve as a geopolitical tool, and Turkey and Ukraine may be seen or should be seen as contributors to this new strategic capacity, particularly in defense, energy, and economic resilience. What I used, don't know how to do this actually. What should I do with this? Anyway,
Maybe click on this button here. This.
this,
No. This one.
this.
On the right.
This one.
Yes. I think it will be bigger if you click.
No,
that.
I want to make it.
This is what you want to make it bigger.
No. Actually, not really, because now I lost the. I don't know how to get back there.
You can just put escape and then you will go back.
Okay. Anyway, so the research question I have mentioned that the theoretical framework what I'm using is basically geopolitical realism. I know it's almost primitive. I know it's very primordial and it's very basic, but my attempt is not to complicate the whole issue because it's not that complicated actually. So I prefer to go back to basics in our theory. Qualitative comparison or comparative case. Yes, I'm using very small number of cases. It's only 2 states, but it's also fine because it perfectly, for instance, it fits to Liphard theory or framework. So the key points, as you can see them, I don't see them here on my screen, but the key points, as you see, is what I mentioned: strategic autonomy. All of them are somehow related to security and so on. The analysis I could have actually drawn on my personal experience with European Commission talks, European Parliament, and so on, because, as I said, I have been very closely working, and I've been related to the accession process of Turkey since 2004, 2005, and the next 10 years or 15 years, I've been very closely working on it, not only following it. But I don't rely on this. I primarily draw on the EU documents, official communications, policy papers, accession reports, summit conclusion, Eurobarometer surveys, and the literature, academic literature on these 2 countries from 2005 till 2025. So what about Turkey? How Turkey, I name it the strategic drift. I want to get rid of this actually. I don't know how. Okay. Strategic drift and the stall. This is so complicated. And stall normative divergence. As we can see, after receiving the candidate status in 1999 till 2025. After this, after the opening of negotiation process, Turkey's accession momentum gradually diminished. And by 2025, now negotiations are effectively frozen, with both parties exhibiting strategic ambivalence rather than commitment. Now, what happened is basically it was also 2013, 2016 was marked by the democratic backsliding, and this all has been recorded and it has been reflected in the documents I have studied, in the reports and all EU Commission papers and so on and so on. But we have to ask the question whether this was really the main reason behind the stalled negotiations, because my Turkish colleagues especially, they would remember that prior that we were struggling in Turkey to open chapters. When we opened them, we couldn't close them because many of them had been frozen. They were frozen negotiation chapters because of Cyprus case, but also because of France and Austria. They have been persistently voicing skepticism, citing not only governance concerns, but also cultural apprehensions regarding Turkey's predominantly Muslim identity and large population. So, and this was way before 2013, before 2016. So, I mean, basically, the accession of process of Turkey had been problematic, not only on the side of Turkey, but on the side of European Union and Turkey. In Turkey, skepticism grew to the point that, so basically it became mutual. Now, the case with Turkey is that despite of normative divergence and other things, Turkey remains too important to be ignored. It is central to migration policy, energy security, and defense innovation. I will not go through this. My colleagues at the panel, they have, I'm sure that their in-depth knowledge is much greater than mine, especially on the defense capabilities. But basically, what we can say that the liminal status of Turkey reflects the contradiction in EU policy. It is recognized but excluded. Too big or too important to be ignored, and it has been always the case. And we can see also from the latest meeting between European Union and Turkey, it was about economy, right? So, but at least something. The case of Ukraine, on the other hand, the Ukraine's path towards European Union accession has unfolded within an unprecedented security crisis, positioning the country as an exceptional candidate. That was the word used. Unlike traditional aspirants who are evaluated primarily through the Copenhagen criteria, Ukraine trajectory has been reshaped by the exigencies of Russia's full-scale invasion. And this has prompted the EU to reframe the enlargement as an instrument of geopolitical resilience. So the EU rhetoric shifted from procedural conditionality to existential solidarity. The existential solidarity is an interesting term. So the Ukraine's accession is no longer solely about the democratization or economic convergence, but also about anchoring the EU's eastern border and deterring Russia aggression. This recalibration was institutionalized with the European Council's decision to grant candidate status in 2022 and to open the accession negotiations in 2024. I will not go into details of identity, but let's look at the numbers. Ukraine economic challenges and strategic investment. Though costly, Ukraine is increasingly seen as a strategic investment. So obviously its resources, resilience, and symbolic importance outweigh its economic liabilities, because this number, this 158 billion plus euros, it's as of 2025, is changing, of course, like constantly since 2022. But the country's vast agricultural base, critical raw materials, and so on, gas reserves, all this, they offer the potential to reduce EU independence on third country suppliers. So obviously the calculation behind this is having something to say into this. But current GDP, even, I mean, it is war impacted, of course, economy. So it is down from pre-war levels. It is showing some signs of resilience. But I included this slide as well. I wanted you to see the comparison with GDP of Turkey. So Ukraine nowadays ranks 55th globally in terms of GDP. These are the latest sources from IMF. It's based on the nominal GDP. And Turkey's economy, not great though, right? We know, all of us, that the recent developments, but it's ranked 16 globally in terms of GDP, which is 1.437 trillion as of today. So yeah, so the question is valid here. I included public opinion as well because it's necessary, since public opinion has long functioned as both a mirror and shaper of the European Union's enlargement strategy. The enlargement strategy, it is framed as a technocratic process driven by compliance with the Copenhagen criteria, but we know that it remains politically sensitive. And here we see the preferences of the member states' electorates. These are the numbers from EU Barometer 2024, because I think the new ones are coming out in the autumn. So support for Ukraine is 45, support for Turkey at 24. But what is interesting, the security priority, according to this year's numbers, are 66. This has grown up. The support for Ukraine and Turkey, it's more or less very similar to like 20 years ago. It doesn't change much. We have to take into consideration the things which are shaping public opinion. We shouldn't actually omit, for instance, the diasporic networks and migration histories. Cultural religious identity, it's more about the narrative and how the narratives are shaping also through the diasporic networks and so on and so on. So but already with my colleagues in 2006, we concluded that public opposition to Turkey's accession may reflect long-standing cultural and religious biases, many times based on the misperceptions rather than perceptions. I included strategic autonomy. I will skip it because Professor Hu anyway mentioned that on Tuesday. It's a part of this enlargement strategy, but we don't need to go through that now, especially because I have only 1 minute left. The key messages, again, I finish, or I will stop here with what I start with. If Ukraine, why not Turkey? That's the, I think, valid question. And in order for European Union to proceed and to fulfill its its strategic autonomy, I don't know, program or vision or whatever we call it, then European Union should, and we should ask this question to ourselves. So the differential treatment of Turkey and Ukraine reveals the inconsistencies. The inconsistencies have been here all the time along, but yes, I mean, we should talk about that. So if security imperatives justify Ukraine's fast-tracked accession, Turkey, given its unmatched strategic value, deserves re-evaluation under the same logic. Of course, we shouldn't forget about Copenhagen criteria and so on, but that's valid for Ukraine as well. So we have to be consistent here. Countries of that size, and that's why I'm comparing them as well, because even though they are not similar, they're similar, they are not the same. Demographically, Turkey is larger and so on, but in terms of enlargement and accession processes, they are very similar when we take, for instance, Malta into consideration or other countries, or even Slovakia. I mean, it's uncomparable, right? It's like a neighborhood of Istanbul. So they are comparable. So we have to apply the same logic. Of course, the recalibrating, I call it recalibrating credibility, we need to balance the strategic imperatives and normative integrity. Without that, it wouldn't work. I don't have time to go through this, but you see what I suggest. So I would finish with saying that the future of enlargement lies in a hybrid model, grounded in values but navigated through interest. Only by reconciling these imperatives can the EU sustain its transformative power and position itself as a decisive actor in the multipolar international order. And the necessity and the urgency have been already voiced by all of you around me in this last 3 days. The enlargement process, when framed within its recalibrated paradigm, is not merely about membership. It is about shaping the contours of Europe's strategic future. So thank you for your attention. I would be very happy to hear your comments, and I would be very happy to include them and refine my article accordingly.
Thank you, Sylvia. Thank you, Sylvia. We move to the next speaker, Alberto Cunha, to talk about the EU and the US relations amid the shifting global international order. Please, let's stick for 10 minutes.
It's going to be difficult, but I'll try. It's going to be difficult to do 10 minutes, I have to say.
We'll give some chance to Q&A.
Yeah, I understand. All right, can you guys see? I understand your difficulty you were sharing. All right, thanks a lot. I have to say, I planned this presentation for 15 minutes, so I'm not sure. I'm going to try my best. So let's basically run through the first one. I'm going to talk to you about the current transition in international order, this very fancy word that also has a very deep meaning. And I argue for that we're coming to a multipolarized order that has a very much a reduced role for the West, as in understood by the United States and European Union. And then I test this with two different theories for the two different meanings of this multipolarized that I introduce. For the Latin America case, as with my previous colleague, my article is nearly done, but not yet, so any comments are very much welcome. So the first part, we're going to talk about literature and international order, and I'm basically going to run through this because it's mostly literature review and we don't have a lot of time. All right. The international order is the set of institutions, norms, rules that govern or define the way states interact. They are about power, they are about ideology, they are about institutions, and they are not necessarily global in nature. There can be several orders. I mean, the classic example is in the Cold War, where you had at least two, maybe more international orders. And the dominant order after the Cold War was definitely the liberal international order, with a big role for the United States. I think most people are aware of what I'm talking about. Where the United States would provide public goods, and the international organizations that came from after 1945 and the Bretton Woods Agreement were broadly respected and seen as players with power in defining these relations between states. I did not talk about several authors, but let's move on. When we talk about order, we talk about several things. We talk about the balance. So how many powers we have? We can have a multipolar order, unipolar order. We can also talk about how the public goods are provided in the system or not, and who provides them, and in what way does the order allow for dominant states, global powers, regional powers to project this power, and in what way? So when we talk about international order, this is what we're talking about. I go into in-depth in the article, but let's move on. And this is not a new argument. Clearly, this liberal international order, however we define it, dominant after 1990, the end of the Cold War, has been disintegrated. I provide three main points in the article, but we could provide more. The integration of China in the liberal international order, namely when they joined the World Trade Organization, was meant to liberalize China, but instead it provided a rivalry with increasing structural power, a concept I will introduce further later. The hyperglobalization reached the elite and produced economic inequality and social discontent, prompting political backlash in the countries that mostly sustain this order, the Western democracies. I mean, President Trump is the main example, but there's many more, be it in Italy, be it Brexit in UK, you all know about this. And then, and I think this is a factor that's probably created the international order since the beginning, the idea that values should be exported through military intervention. And now we see this in a very negative way, but I remember when I was a kid in the 90s, the idea of liberal international, that we would bring democracy to other countries. This was a great thing that we were doing. This has completely lost its credibility because of the dual standards that the United States, but only the West in general uses, and also the very, very diverging misuse of the United Nations institutions when it comes to this idea of exporting democracy, because we all know that international law defends human rights, but it also defends sovereignty. And where the line is traced between the two, this is a conflict that we've never really fully resolved. All right. So what I'm actually doing in this article, I'm providing where I see the international order moving now, introducing a concept called multipolarization, which you might have seen in a slightly different way in the Munich Security Conference. It was a topic this year. And so what is a multipolarized order? It should be seen as two different meanings. First, that there is a polarization within the democracies that sustain the liberal international order, and this polarization, be it in the United States, in European and even Latin America, as I will demonstrate, weakens the main supporters of the liberal international order, so the order was already decaying, and now it's dead because even within the democracies that support it, the polarization means that it's no longer, and again, the United States is a clear example, not the only one, but it's also multipolarized because you now have different poles of power, namely non-Western, that feed upon the first polarization, and now we have not only a multipolar world, but we have a multipolarized world because we have polarization that is both domestic and international. I could go more in depth, but I don't think I have more time, so let's move on. And so trying to see the evolution, so we had the Cold War with the two main orders, capitalist and socialist orders from 1945 to 1990. This was a bipolar order where the role of international institutions was thin, at least international institutions applied globally. Then we had a liberal international order starting in 1990, which I end in 2008 because of the global financial crisis. I think that's a fairly acceptable endpoint. It was a unipolar order. It was ideological driven, end of history, Fukuyama, democracy as one, free trade, the rest. All of these international institutions, especially IMF, World Bank, they really reached the peak of their influence here. And then after 2008, and this is where we can have, of course, an interesting discussion, I argue that there was not necessarily already a multipolar order, there was just a disintegration of what existed. And we had what I would call transactional regionalism. This is adapted from some authors. I mentioned this in the author, and I'm willing to discuss. So the role of institutions was still reduced, but was present because regions were fracturing. And now we have a multipolarized world order, which I start obviously in 2022 because this is a direct challenge posed to the liberal international order in Europe, where we go back to the same order as in the Cold War, this balance of power and ideological competition and very small role of international institutions. So this is what I propose. There's a lot of stuff here. Let's just move on. I already explained this 2 minutes. I thought about 15 minutes. All right, I think we can just move on from this. All right, so can I show that the West as an entity is not only polarized but weaker in the world? I mean, definitely inside the EU, and this was the topic of my PhD in King's College London. I talked about the process of European disintegration connected to the poly-crisis, namely the Euro crisis and migration crisis that have, in short, reduced the credibility of the EU supranational institutions. They have pushed the interests of stronger countries versus weaker countries, North versus South, West versus East. It also meant, and I think this was very well reflected in the previous presentation, that there is now a very established conflict between the EU as a normative actor and a geopolitical actor. Can it be both? Is it both? Nobody really knows. In the United States, of course, even before the famous January 2021, I would argue that the role of of the United States as this beacon of human rights, which had already been criticized in the 90s, definitely reached this peak in the 2000s. And now we have the America First approach, and I will quote an African politician that I met in a conference now in Germany. He said that for most American politicians, America was always America First, so they just see it as a slogan. But in a way, it's a corollary of this process where the United States now can sustain being the leader or the beacon of disorder. The failure to integrate Russia within Euro-Atlantic structures, I suspect that some people will have an issue with the way I phrase this sentence, but just because Russia as a regime, it has an invasion that is undisputable, it does not mean that there was not a failure, because there was, at least rhetorically, an attempt to integrate them into Euro-Atlantic structures, and clearly this did not happen. So that is a failure for me. And an effective defeat. And you talked about EU documents. EU documents in very EU language, they talked about challenges in the so-called arc of visibility. Well, the EU was defeated, and the West was defeated in trying to solve these challenges because they did mention that this was a priority, and they failed. I think this is fair to say. All right. Latin America study case. Latin America is how much time do I have? Nice, please. Almost 5, good. Latin America is an obvious case because, first of all, there are obvious linguistic and cultural attachment to the West, and we are in the Iberian Peninsula, so these ties are even stronger here. There's also actually a very similar historic process with the United States, this beacon of the liberal international order, because you had the revolution against the European colonial powers. You had civil wars that eventually led to a strengthening of democracy. Of course, the parallel is not perfect, but if there is a region where we can test whether the West's reduced role is happening and whether polarization is happening, in effect, it's Latin America. It's also it's still a democratic, like most of the democratic regime, so you can see this polarization in a perfect way. I included this because, of course, there has been a long attempt, mostly failed, to integrate politically the full Latin America. There's a lot of different acronyms. There's Mercosur, and there's Andean Community, and there's now UNISUR, which mostly failed. So there will be a lot to delve into. I mentioned this in the article, but let's move on. And of course, there was a project by the United States to have a free trade area that would embark the whole Americas. Since Eisenhower, this failed. So we have a very fragmented picture in Latin American Caribbean, which mirrors the fragmentation that we see globally. This is a map from the trade areas in the world. All right, so how am I going to measure this reduced role for the West? I chose one of my favorite authors, which I also use in my PhD and adapted it to a broader framework, which is Susan Strange. Some people might be familiar. I would argue that she is one of the most underappreciated IR theorists of the 20th century, and she uses something called structural power. I extensively explain what this is. It will be a lot of time. So she defines that we can see structural power in four main structures: production, financial, security, and the control of knowledge or ideology. And here the control of knowledge could be not just understood as controlling the message, but also controlling the means of diffusing. So you're talking about AI. When you control AI or you control the database, you also control the information. So it has this dual meaning. And then she also mentioned four secondary structures: transport, trade, energy, and welfare. So this is what I'm going to use, and I'm going to apply this to Latin America. So this is in her book, State and Markets. That's where she fully develops the model. All right, so in the security structure, its states, military aids still exists, and this is probably the main structure where the West is still dominant in Latin America. The West, the NATO does not extend to the Atlantic South, as it was mentioned in the first presentation, or to Africa, but also could be said about Latin America. And China and the BRICS bloc, which are compared with the West, they have been actually increasing a lot of arms sales cooperation, namely with Brazil, but not only. So this is the most dominant of the West, but even there, they are losing their dominance. In production, the West has already lost the war in Latin America. This is what happens. China is the main trading power for most of Latin American countries, including the most important ones. So this is already been lost. In the financial structure, the Latin America countries less and less are reluctant to engage with the IMF and World Bank on their rules and their conditionality. There's a difficult story, for instance, in countries as Argentina dealing with the IMF. China at the same time with the Asian Infrastructure Bank, the China Development Bank. There's even plans to have a currency in BRICS. I'm not sure if this will happen, but clearly they are moving very fast in the structure as well. And in terms of knowledge ideational structure, anyone that talks with Latin America elites can understand that they're not just on the left, but their discontentment with the narrative of this level of international order is widespread. And China, they are not necessarily an attractive model, but they do control more and more sources of information. So even on the technological side, I need to speed up, right? All right, I'm gonna try. Right, there's also secondary structures. I'm not going to talk about them now. Let's just talk about the two most obvious ones: the trade structure. China and the BRICS Forum, not just China, have really deepened their cooperation with the Latin America, while the EU has struggled for 25 years to sign a trade deal. We'll go back to that. And on the energy structure, the BRICS countries are now major investors in several energy projects in the EU. there has been some effort by the European Investment Bank, but clearly not enough. I could talk more. Let's move on. So what are the trends? The BRICS and China now project structural power across all dimensions. The Belt and Road Initiative is much larger than the Global Gateway. The United States does not have any rival infrastructure, and the foreign investment from the United States is very much dependent on trends. The last normative appeal on conditional aid model is increasingly outcompeted by China's no strings attached order. This also happens in Africa, but certainly happens in Latin America, because also they don't buy the narrative, so this is all connected. This reflects multipolarization in practice, so China's structural presence that is enabled by the polarization, the lack of structural approach by the EU, US and the EU. Okay, I have to move on. Yes, so not only decline of international fragmentation, but the consequence of China's and the BRICS increasing ability to shape. All right. Very quickly, the second empirical test is connected with polarization. Polarization is a big problem in democracies in Latin America, big dissatisfaction. I actually used several surveys that were conducted in Latin America. I have to go through them quickly. There's also a lot of story of difficult transitions to democracies in these countries, so conditions that already exist in Latin America. It's not something relatively new. There's a rise of populism in several countries, both on the right and on the left, and actually Latin America has always been shifting towards left and right, and this also undermines the Europe and US approach, because they also have their own polarization going, and I think I need to move on. All right, last but not least, now 1 minute. Possible routes for the West. It seems like the United States, when it comes to Latin America, balances between trying to be a sort of Rush dad hegemon and disinterest, and the EU does not yet have a structured approach to Latin America, even though they have all the possible advantages, culturally speaking, historical. I would argue that, and I made this clear in my article and some numbers here, this is the Mercosur deal is the most obvious win-win for the European Union right now. And even on the environmental risks that I mentioned here, and I will stop with this, it seems like we're doing something great in the European Union, but actually what is happening is that if we don't sign this deal, and this has already been happening, China will make products and BRICS will make products that don't have any sort of environmental standards. So actually we are not only hurting our economy, but we are also hurting the environment. And yes, there's a lot of critical minerals in Latin America, exactly those that the EU needs for its transformation and security capabilities. And I am on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Alberto. I mean, we can discuss it in hours because it's very very rich presentation. Thank you so much. So we'll move to our next speaker, Ricardo, talk about the EU's collective response to the COVID crisis.
For this delay, I think this is usual in this kind of conferences. So my name is Ricardo-Pereira. I'm a PhD candidate. I'm in my second year of law, my PhD in law and government at Dublin City University. I'm also a member of the DCU Conflict Institute. And today I will start by presenting part of my PhD project that is related with the collective securitization of COVID-19 by the European Union. In this work, what I'm arguing for is for the use of organizational learning to compensate what collective securitization lacks in terms of explaining the routinization process. But first of all, I like to do this question in every single presentation that I do. That is, why is still relevant to study COVID-19 nowadays? And first of all, regarding the exceptionality of the threat. So regarding the number of deaths and multidimensional threats that the COVID was, in terms of cyber, in terms of health, in terms of social and economic dimensions. At the same time, we had this lack of cooperation, coordination at the international level, here specifically within the EU, and we need to remember that indeed the EU has union in its name for something, right? Even in terms of historic memory. At the same time, there is a gap in the literature, because usually when we look to EU health, we look through a perspective of integration, but we lack a certain approach of security, to understand health through a security lens. So I'm trying here is to converge these three themes to see what results from here, even though now works from Oscar Fernandez and other people from ULCOV network have already covered in part this gap. So this is my theoretical framework. There is my research question: to what extent did the EU collective securitization of COVID-19 drive the integration of EU response to the pandemic in the health domain between 2020 and 2025, even though the pandemic ended in 2023, but the aim of this research is to identify if the practices that emerged from the EU response to the pandemic, if they were integrated in the union structure or not. For that, I argue that the model of Sperling and Weber of collective securitization, based on the work of Aiken Williams from 2007, if I'm not wrong with the date, needs a certain reformulation in the last step of the model, when they talk about the routinization of new practices, new policies, new vocabulary, and new agenda that creates a new status quo within the organization. So here I argue for the addition of certain terms from organizational learning to identify how actually routinization occurs. And for that, I argue that in the recursive interaction step, we need to look to how the member states and the EU actors codify and do advocacy regarding measures to be applied to respond to the threat. And in the routinization step, I argue for to look to this sub-process, like dissemination and training, to identify some micro practices that can emerge from this response. In this way, now we can conclude by arguing if we had a single or a double loop learning. So in this way, if we have a change in the status quo of the organization or a mere change of practices. For that, the aim of this project is to do an engaged research approach with an interpretativist methodology based on document analysis, elite interviews, participatory inquiry, and discourse analysis. For now, I have already collected 52 speeches from the European Commission to analyze what action were took regarding the threat. And here I will try to just be quickly. This part is just to understand if indeed this reform or this emerge of new practices occur within the EU structure by applying this engaged research idea, that is, bring politicians, practitioners, and academics together and make them actually active research participants in our project. So in this way, I will start by build a trust and network with these actors, and then we engage with them through interviews and focus group to then bring these communities together to actually do a dialogue group and understand perspectives and specificities of each community, and in this way to create, I would say, a general approach to the case of emerging of practices within the EU health domain. So here is a brief analysis of speeches from 2020 to 2021, where I identified 5 phases where the EU respond to COVID. I will try to be quick in this section. Through discourse analysis, we can identify discourse strategies like the demonization of the pandemic, the criminalization of the pandemic, the creation of us and them. At the same time, we can identify some games of numbers, some metaphors, some hyperboles that the EU used to actually to securitize the COVID, not just only as a health threat, but at the same time as a multidimensional threat. Here I'm talking about as a cyber threat with infodemics, that Borrell coined this term relating the fake news that emerged in the middle of 2020, and in 2021 when Ursula von der Leyen started touching the COVID-19 with climate change by saying that indeed we need to, in terms of the EU, we need to look to health threats in a comprehensive approach and to address this through one health policy in all domains. In here, I would just mention some practices that have emerged. Here you have an idea what is the rescue strategic stockpile, and I highlight in red in the terms of using health, but in military terms. So there we have the actions of the EU to actually defend or to support Ukraine regarding CBRN threats. This is important because during, I would say, from 70s, 80s, when the Union start responding health threats with Europe against cancer and then with Europe against HIV, we can say that indeed the EU has an approach regarding health, but even though we know that this competence is shared, and it's a weak competence where states continue to have power. So when we have this type of cases where the Union can create and coordinate this kind of structures, we need to be at least impressed. Another point is this bio-container in Rwanda. It was part of the deployment of EU capabilities to support third countries. But in here, I need to do some critiques regarding the lack of cooperation between the EU and these countries, because in terms of know-how, the EU refuses to share this kind of know-how, and even in terms of logistics, there is a lack or underdevelopment of this logistics. So people that are in rural areas or in the periphery hardly will receive this kind of support. And I need to mention at the same time that these bio-containers are not just responding to COVID consequences, but at the same time other kinds of disease like HIV, just to mention a few. So as a conclusion, here I would like to highlight the capacity to characterize the COVID-19 through securitization as a global health crisis. More than that, the more stable approach regarding the securitization conducted by an international organization compared with its member states, in this case in the European Union. And at the same time, if we look in detail for the construction of threat and the construction of security, we can identify that is an inconstant characterization of the threat. So we have waves where we can identify that the COVID-19 is identified as a brutal threat, But at the same time, we have waves that we can see that COVID-19 is constructed as an existential threat, so discursively constructed. But in the opposite side, when we talk about security construction, we have a constant construction of the EU as a health security actor. And we arrive in 2021 with Ursula von der Leyen coining the term that the EU is the pharmacy of the world. Well, I will leave this to your imagination, but to continue. The Commission also took advantage of this window of opportunity to actually debate the competence in the health domain, but the conflict between Russia and Ukraine kind of stole the spotlight for this debate, and it's almost abandoned. Let's see what will happen with the new health program in 2026, 2027. But for now, what we can see is just a convergence between health and cyber. And to conclude, in terms of theory, if we can see this recursive interaction happening and empowering the Commission with symbolical and representative authority to answer in a coordinated way to an event, so we can agree that collective securitization emerge as a possible theory to look to international organizations as securitizing actors. I hope we balance the time now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ricardo. To our last speaker, finally, Zviad Abashidze, to talk about resilience and ethnic minorities in Georgia.
Już ten taką kulturę oficjalną.
Can you try this one?
Yeah.
Okay. Existe Coimbra.
Yeah, okay.
So, sorry.
Hello to everyone.
You want to share, no?
Sorry.
Go on Zoom. Yeah. Oh.
Thank you to everyone. So my presentation about Georgia is very typical. Then I mean, very specific presentation, but what why it's interesting, maybe for the wider audience. Generally, when we are speaking about this, the resilience, traditionally we regarded resilience and security from the understanding of Hobbesian tradition when it comes to the security about the international security, just political institutions, just army, and so on. But sometimes, the last times also some good questions like economic resilience, economic security also played quite a big role in the construction of security in general. But I think that from this the point of view, the minority issues, sometimes we can just connect with these security issues, especially in the countries with so-called late modernization and late formation of so-called nation state, unlike all the countries who started to construct their nation state in 19th century at the beginning, especially 19th century. The Georgia is a country of so-called late modernization who started to construct its nation state in at the beginning of the 20th century. We had only a 3 years republic, then Soviet Russians came there and they established the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was the kind of new type of so-called modernized states, from the one side who was based on egalitarianism and self-determination, national self-determination, but at the same time it was a new type of the Russian Empire, I would say.
So, what's interesting is that traditionally for the Eastern, so-called Eastern European countries, the minorities issues are closely connected with the securitization the process. As far as those countries constructed the state a little bit late. And when, especially if you take the period so-called interwar periods, you will see lots of so-called ethnic tensions and ethnic conflict within the states, because the heritage they got from the big empires was sometimes wasn't really compatible with their traditional understanding of their nation and national self-determination. So now, if you take a Georgian case, we can just see the several problems from the point of view of why we can connect the securitization process to the resilience institution. The first one is a so-called Soviet socio-cultural past. Another one is so-called moral standard international obligations. The third one is so-called the process of civil integration and the results of civil integration of minorities within the one society. So this is Georgia. This is the ethnic part. You'll see this one. Actually, if you go to the census of Georgia, you'll see these percentages of ethnic composition of Georgia. And now about 86% of the local Georgian population is ethnically the Georgians. You know, from this point of view, it's not seems very heterogeneous. Let's say seems more little bit homogeneous. But if you take into consideration what does it mean to be a big minority with the Georgian case, and not only Georgia, within the former Soviet states in generally. If you take in this case Azerbaijan, Azerians, Armenians, cases who are populated to the southern part there. What does it mean? That means that the compactly populated minorities, they are not integrated as one society. They are quite standing a little bit outside of the society. So I explain why. This census of 1989, the last census of Soviet Union, and by those times, ethnic composition of Georgia was more heterogeneous. That we compare the actual situation. Why? Because after the collapse of the Soviet Union, you know, some problems. We got these former Soviet states, and we got lots of problems within the internal wars. Caused the economic problems, caused the big immigration outside the country, and so on. So this type of problem is more or less the same for the whole post-Soviet states. So, what does the Soviet context? Soviet context means to understand the nation and ethnicity absolutely in different types. What I mean, if you take the typical Western nation state, for example, even I don't know, France or the Portugal, everyone, the part of the nation, it means, first of all, coming from the citizenship, you know. But if you take the Soviet case and the Soviet Union case, the idea of nationality is not a citizenship. Idea of nationality is strongly ethnicity. So that's why if we are taking the former communist states and we are talking about this ethnic, the heterogeneity of this situation. Why is it dangerous? It's dangerous because ethnicity, so-called nationalities, you saw it understanding, they feel themselves totally estranged from the given society. They don't feel themselves as a part of, generalized nation, not just the nation of the citizens. That means coming from the idea of democracy and representative government. So when the former Soviet states that just started to construct the neoliberal democracies, they immediately got this, the problems. Even now, if you take the Ukrainian situation, you will never understand Ukrainian situation if you don't understand the case, because so-called the Russian population in the eastern part of Ukraine, most of they felt themselves not a part of Ukraine. They felt themselves part of Russia, because their process of socialization. It wasn't a strategy to construct Ukrainian community as a community of citizens. It was a project to construct Ukraine as a, let's say, coexistence of different nations, So that's why when the former Soviet states there is starting to construct a new nation state in terms of liberal democracies, they have to somehow to overcome this problem to re-socialize minorities that they got from the Soviet past. Because in Soviet past, being a minority meant being a part of social group within the big hierarchy of a society. It wasn't just being a part of just a cultural group. It was a part of a social group. So from another side, Georgia is a part of many regulations from the international context, like many European Framework Convention of Minorities, some part of OSCE, and you'll see it on the screen. And what does it mean? That means that Georgia should not only is obliged to integrate the minority within their society, but at the same time they should integrate minority within the society because of international regulations as well. So that's why this is another challenge. That's why for the country how to handle this from the one side, from the past and present they are giving, at the same time how to handle with these international obligations. Now, if you take some sociological polls, we got lots of polls in Georgia about these minority issues. Most of these compactly populated minorities, they don't speak Georgian as a state language. They speak mostly in their own languages. Because during the Soviet times, minorities mostly they were taught in their own ethnic languages and Russian. They have a high competency in Russian. Georgia, for example, for them it was like a second-hand language because of Georgia was a part in its terms of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, it was the Russian Empire. We can see lots of researches about the Soviet Union, how they construct this, let's say, community of different nations. We can just see many Sovietologists who say that how they kept, for example, Lenin kept idea of self-determination, and Soviet Union was composed by the so-called national republics, and it was a kind of paradise of the for different nationalities. But in reality, this was a near former Russian Empire. But it's Lenin just a little bit reconstruct the empire which they got from the Romanovs Empire. They started to reconstruct this idea, but the Soviet idea, what was the main Soviet idea? The Russia is a big brother for everyone. Russian language is primarily the most of the desirable language for everyone. It's a state obliged language, and all the other languages and the nations or nationalities, they were subordinating to this big brotherhood, who was led by Russians. So that's why this so-called titular nations politics, going from the 20s or 30s, within the one national republics, they made several nations within the one nation. So that's why minorities are not just ordinary minorities; they are just nations within the nations. What's the conclusion that? That's why I mean that when we're talking about the resilience and the resilience of institutions and economics and so on, from this understanding, from my understanding, sometimes it's possible also to connect these issues to the minority issues, because once again, for the former Soviet Union countries, the countries of so-called late modernization, minorities, it's not just a part of just cultural diversity and cultural, just coexistence or multiculturalism, like if you take Western societies, for example. Even for Western society, sometimes if you take the theories of postmodernism, deconstruction, and so on, the idea of nations was just out of the modernity, out of the current situation. But I see that Russians were in Ukraine, back bring the idea of nation. Once again, it confronts, I would say, the idea of postmodernist like it was developed in the Western society by those times. That's why, okay, from the one side, we have the society of, Western European and just Western society. From the other hand, we had also more or less the Western society, but with little bit with different histories and different contexts. And that's why the traditional concept that we are taking from the Western parts, which are just trying to use it in the not Western context. We should somehow to handle with local peculiarities. In this case, minority issues are one of the peculiarities of the former communist Soviet countries that should be understood even from the understanding of resilience and security. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Zviad. I mean, we're already past the time. So if the organizers are okay, I would maybe suggest that the feedback would be chat on the cafe and so forth during the break. If the panelists are also okay, because I'm sure that a lot of people, they want feedback for their presentations and so forth, so that we don't. Okay, everyone fine? Unanimous agreement? Great. So see you in 30 minutes. Thanks.